Pinocchio, not knowing where to hide himself for shame, tried to run out of the room. But he did not succeed, for his nose had increased so much that it could no longer pass through the door. Pinocchio meets again the fox and the cat and goes with them to bury his money in the field of miracles. The fairy, as you can imagine, allowed the puppet to cry and to roar for a good half-hour over his nose, which could no longer pass through the door of the room. This she did to give him a severe lesson, and to correct him of the disgraceful fault of telling lies, the most disgraceful fault that a boy can have. But when she saw him quite disfigured, and his eyes swollen out of his head from weeping, she felt full of compassion for him. She therefore clapped her hands, and at that signal 1,000 large birds called woodpeckers flew in at the window. They immediately perched on Pinocchio's nose and began to peck at it with such zeal that in a few minutes his enormous and ridiculous nose was reduced to its usual dimensions. "What a good fairy you are," said the puppet, drying his eyes. "And how much I love you." "I love you also," answered the fairy, "and if you remain with me, you shall be my little brother, and I will be your good little sister." "I would remain willingly, but my poor papa, I have thought of everything. I've already let your father know, and he will be here tonight." "Really?" shouted Pinocchio, jumping for joy. "Then, little fairy, if you consent, I should like to go and meet him. I'm so anxious to give a kiss to that poor old man who has suffered so much on my account that I am counting the minutes." "Go then, but be careful not to lose yourself. Take the road through the wood, and I am sure that you will meet him." Pinocchio set out, and as soon as he was in the wood, he began to run like a young goat. But when he reached a certain spot, almost in front of the big oak, he stopped, because he thought that he heard people amongst the bushes. In fact, 2 persons came out onto the road. Can you guess who they were? His 2 travelling companions, the fox and the cat, with whom he had supped at the inn of the Red Crayfish. "Why, here's our dear Pinocchio," cried the fox, kissing and embracing him. "How come you to be here? How come you to be here?" repeated the cat. "It's a long story," answered the puppet, "and I'll tell you when I have time. But do you know that the other night, when you left me alone at the inn, I met with assassins on the road, assassins. Oh, poor Pinocchio. And what did they want? They wanted to rob me of my gold pieces. Villains, said the fox. Infamous villains, repeated the cat. But I ran away from them, continued the puppet, and they followed me, and at last they overtook me and hung me to a branch of that oak tree. And Pinocchio pointed to the big oak, which was 2 steps from them. Is it possible to have anything more dreadful? Said the fox. In what a world we are condemned to live. Where can respectable people like us find a safe refuge? Whilst they were thus talking, Pinocchio observed that the cat was lame on her front right leg, for in fact she had lost her front paw with all its claws. He therefore asked her, "What have you done with your paw?" The cat tried to answer, but became confused. Therefore, the fox said immediately, "My friend is too modest, and that is why she doesn't speak. I will answer for her. I must tell you that an hour ago we met an old wolf on the road, almost fainting from want of food, who asked alms of us. Not having so much as a fishbone to give him, what did my friend, who has really a heart of gold, do? She bit off one of her 4 paws and threw it to that poor beast, that he might appease his hunger." And the fox, in relating this, dried a tear. Pinocchio was also touched, and approaching the cat, he whispered into her ear, "If all cats resembled you, how fortunate the mice would be. And now, what are you doing here?" asked the fox of the puppet. "I am waiting for my papa, whom I expect to arrive every moment." "And your gold pieces?" "I've got them in my pocket, all but one that I spent at the Inn of the Red Crayfish. And to think that instead of 4 pieces by tomorrow, they might become 1 or 2,000. Why do you not listen to my advice? Why will you not go and bury them in the field of miracles? Today's impossible. I will go another day." "Another day? It will be too late," said the fox. "Why?" "Because the field has been bought by a nobleman, and after tomorrow no one will be allowed to bury money there. How far off is the Field of Miracles? Not 2 miles. Will you come with us? In half an hour you will be there. You can bury your money at once, and in a few minutes you'll collect 2,000, and this evening you'll return with your pockets full. Will you come with us? Pinocchio thought of the good fairy, old Geppetto, and the warnings of the talking cricket, and he hesitated a little before answering. He ended, however, by doing as all boys do who have not a grain of sense and who have no heart. He ended by giving his head a little shake and saying to the fox and the cat, "Let us go, I'll come with you," and they went. After having walked half the day, they reached a town that was called Booby Town. As soon as Pinocchio entered this town, he saw that the streets were crowded with dogs who had lost their coats and who were yawning from hunger, shorn sheep trembling with cold, cocks without combs or crests who were begging for grain of Indian corn, large butterflies who could no longer fly because they had sold their beautiful colored wings, peacocks who had no tails and were ashamed to be seen, and pheasants who went scratching about in a subdued fashion, mourning for their brilliant gold and silver feathers gone forever. In the midst of this crowd of beggars and shamefaced creatures, some lordly carriage passed from time to time, containing a fox, or a thieving magpie, or some ravenous bird of prey. "And where is the Field of Miracles?" asked Pinocchio. "It is here, not 2 steps from us." They crossed the town, and having gone beyond the walls, they came to a solitary field, which at first sight resembled all other fields. "We are arrived," said the fox to the puppet. "Now, stoop down and dig with your hands a little hole in the ground and put your gold pieces into it." Pinocchio obeyed. He dug a hole, put into it the 4 gold pieces that he had left, and then filled up the hole with a little earth. "Now then," said the fox, "go to that canal close to us, fetch a can of water, and water the ground where you have sowed them." Pinocchio went to the canal, and as he had no can, he took off one of his old shoes, and filling it with water, he watered the ground over the hole. Then he asked, "Is there anything else to be done?" "Nothing else," answered the fox. We can now go away. You can return in about 20 minutes, and you'll find a shrub already pushing through the ground with its branches quite loaded with money. The poor puppet, beside himself with joy, thanked the fox and the cat 1,000 times and promised them a beautiful present. "We wish for no presents," answered the two rascals. "It is enough for us to have taught you the way to enrich yourself without undergoing hard work, and we are as happy as folk out for holiday." Thus saying, they took leave of Pinocchio, and wishing him a good harvest, went about their business. Pinocchio is robbed of his money, and as a punishment he's sent to prison for 4 months. The puppet returned to the town and began to count the minutes one by one, and when he thought that it must be time, he took the road leading to the field of miracles. And as he walked along with hurried steps, his heart beat fast, tick-tack, tick-tack, like a drawing-room clock when it is really going well. Meanwhile, he was thinking to himself, "And if instead of 1,000 gold pieces I was to find on the branches of the tree 2,000, and instead of 2,000, supposing I found 5,000, and instead of 5,000 that I found 100,000? Oh, what a fine gentleman I should then become. I would have a beautiful palace, 1,000 little wooden horses, and 1,000 stables to amuse myself with, a cellar full of currant wine and sweet syrups, and a library quite full of candies, tarts, plum cakes, macaroons, and cream biscuits." Whilst he was building these castles in the air, he had arrived in the neighborhood of the field, and he stopped to look if by chance he could perceive a tree with its branches laden with money. But he saw nothing. He advanced another 100 steps. Nothing. He entered the field. He went right up to the little hole where he had buried his sovereigns, and nothing. He then became very thoughtful, and forgetting the rules of society and good manners, he took his hands out of his pocket and gave his head a long scratch. At that moment he heard an explosion of laughter close to him, and looking up he saw a large parrot perched on a tree who was pruning the few feathers he had left. "Why are you laughing?" asked Pinocchio in an angry voice. "I am laughing because in pruning my feathers I tickled myself under my wings." The puppet did not answer, but went to the canal and filling the same old shoe full of water, he proceeded to water the earth afresh that covered his gold pieces. Whilst he was thus occupied, another laugh, and still more impertinent than the first, rang out in the silence of that solitary place. "Once for all," shouted Pinocchio in a rage, "may I know, you ill-mannered parrot, what are you laughing at?" "I am laughing at those simpletons who believe in all the foolish things that are told them, and who allow themselves to be entrapped by those who are more cunning than they are." "Are you perhaps speaking of me?" "Yes, I am speaking of you, poor Pinocchio, of you who are simple enough to believe that money can be sown and gathered in fields in the same way as beans and pumpkins. I also believed it at once, and today I am suffering for it. Today, but it is too late. I have at last learnt that to put a few pennies honestly together, it is necessary to know how to earn them, either by the work of our own hands or by the cleverness of our own brains." "I don't understand you," said the puppet, who was already trembling with fear. "Have patience. I will explain myself better," rejoined the parrot. "You must know, then, that whilst you were in the town, the fox and the cat returned to the field. They took the buried money and then fled like the wind, and now he that catches them will be clever." Pinocchio remained with his mouth open, and not choosing to believe the parrot's words, he began with his hands and nails to dig up the dirt that he had watered. And he dug and dug and dug, and made such a deep hole that a rick of straw might have stood upright in it. But the money was no longer there. He rushed back to the town in a state of desperation, and went at once to the courts of justice to denounce the two knaves who had robbed him to the judge. The judge was a big ape of the gorilla tribe, an old ape respectable for his age, his white beard, but especially for his gold spectacles without glasses that he always obliged to wear, on account of an inflammation of the eyes that had tormented him for many years. Pinocchio related in the presence of the judge all the particulars of the infamous fraud of which he had been the victim. He gave the names, the surnames, and other details of the two rascals, and ended by demanding justice. The judge listened with great benignity, took a lively interest in the story, was much touched and moved, and when the puppet had nothing further to say, he stretched out his hand and rang a bell. At this summons, two mastiffs immediately appeared, dressed as policemen. The judges then, pointing to Pinocchio, said to them, "That poor devil has been robbed of 4 gold pieces. Take him off and put him immediately into prison." The puppet was petrified on hearing this unexpected sentence and tried to protest, but the policeman, to avoid losing time, stopped his mouth and carried him off to the lockup. And there he remained for 4 months, 4 long months, and he would have remained longer still if a fortunate chance had not released him. For I must tell you that the young emperor, who regned over Bubitan, having won a splendid victory over his enemies, ordered great public rejoicings. There were illuminations, fireworks, horse races, and bicycle races. And as a further sign of triumph, he commanded that the prisons should be opened and all the prisoners set at liberty. "If the others are to be let out of prison, I will go also," said Pinocchio to the jailer. "No, not you," said the jailer, "because you do not belong to the fortunate class." "I beg your pardon," replied Pinocchio. "I am also a criminal." "In that case, you were perfectly right," said the jailer, and taking off his hat and bowing to him respectfully, he opened the prison doors and let him escape. Freed from prison, he starts to return to the fairy's house, but on the road he meets with a horrible serpent, and afterwards he is caught in a trap. You can imagine Pinocchio's joy when he found himself free. Without stopping to take breath, he immediately left the town and took the road that led to the fairy's house. On account of the rainy weather, the road had become a marsh into which he sank knee-deep. But the puppet would not give in. Tormented by the desire of seeing his father and his little sister with the blue hair again, he ran and leapt like a greyhound. And as he ran, he was splashed with mud from head to foot. And he said to himself as he went along, "How many misfortunes have happened to me, and I deserved them, for I am an obstinate, self-willed puppet. I am always bent upon having my own way, without listening to those who wish me well, and who have 1,000 times more sense than I have. But from this time forth, I am determined to change and to become orderly and obedient. For the last time, I have seen that disobedient boys come to no good and gain nothing. And will my papa have waited for me? Shall I find him at the fairy's house? Poor man, it is so long since I last saw him. I am dying to embrace him and to cover him with kisses. And will the fairy forgive me my bad conduct to her? To think of all the kindness and loving care I received from her. To think that if I am not alive, I owe it to her. Would it be possible to find a more ungrateful boy, or one with less heart than I have? Whilst he was saying this, he stopped suddenly, frightened to death, and made 4 steps backwards. What had he seen? He had seen an immense serpent stretched across the road. Its skin was green. It had red eyes and a pointed tail that was smoking like a chimney. It would be impossible to imagine the puppet's terror. He walked away to a safe distance, and sitting down on a heap of stones, waited until the serpent should have gone about its business and had left the road clear. He waited for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, but the serpent was always there, and even from a distance he could see the red light of his fiery eyes and the column of smoke that ascended from the end of his tail. At last, Pinocchio, trying to feel courageous, approached to within a few steps and said to the serpent in a small, soft, insinuating voice, "Excuse me, Mr. Serpent, but would you be so good as to move a little to one side, just enough to allow me to pass?" He might as well have spoken to the wall. Nobody moved. He began again in the same soft voice. "You must know, Mr. Serpent, that I am on my way home, where my father is waiting for me, and it is such a long time since I saw him last. Will you therefore allow me to continue my road?" He waited for sign in answer to this request, but there was none. In fact, the serpent, who up to that moment had been sprightly and full of life, became motionless and almost rigid. He shut his eyes, and his tail ceased smoking. "Can he really be dead?" said Pinocchio, rubbing his hands with delight, and he determined to jump over him and reach the other side of the road. But just as he was going to leap, the serpent raised himself suddenly on end, like a spring set in motion, and the puppet, drawing back in his terror, caught his foot and fell to the ground. And he fell so awkwardly that his head stuck in the mud and his legs went into the air. At the sight of the puppet kicking violently with his head in the mud, the serpent went into convulsions of laughter, and he laughed and laughed and laughed until, from the violence of his laughter, he broke a blood vessel in his chest and died. And that time he was really dead. Pinocchio then set off running in hopes that he should reach the fairy's house before dark. But before long he began to suffer so dreadfully from hunger that he could not bear it, and he jumped into a field by the wayside, intending to pick some bunches of muscatel grapes. Oh, that he had never done it! He had scarcely reached the vines when, crack! His legs were caught between two sharp iron bars, and he became so giddy with pain that stars of every colour danced before his eyes. The poor puppet had been caught in a trap, put there to capture some big polecats who were the scourge of the poultry yards in the neighbourhood. Pinocchio is taken by a peasant who obliges him to take the place of his watchdog in the poultry yard. Pinocchio, as you can imagine, began to cry and scream, but his tears and groans were useless, for there was not a house to be seen, and not a living soul passed down the road. At last night came on, partly from the pain of the trap that cut his legs, and a little from fear at finding himself alone in the dark in the midst of the fields. The puppet was on the point of fainting. Just at that moment he saw a firefly flitting over his head. He called to it and said, "Oh, little firefly, will you have pity on me and free me from this torture?" "Poor boy," said the firefly, stopping and looking at him with compassion. "But how could your legs have been caught by those sharp irons?" "I came into the field to pick 2 bunches of these muscatel grapes, and—" "But were the grapes yours?" "No." "Then who taught you to carry off other people's property?" "I was so hungry." "Hunger, my boy, is not a good reason for taking what does not belong to us." "That is true, that is true," said Pinocchio, crying. "I will never do it again." At this moment the conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of approaching footsteps. It was the owner of the field, coming on tiptoe to see if one of the polecats had ate his chickens during the night, had been caught in his trap. His astonishment was great when, having brought out his lantern from under his coat, he perceived that, instead of a polecat, it was a boy who had been caught. "Ah, little thief," said the angry peasant, "then it's you who carry off my chickens?" "No, it is not me. Indeed it is not," cried Pinocchio, sobbing. "I only came into the field to take 2 bunches of grapes." "He who steals grapes is quite capable of stealing chickens. Leave it to me. I'll give you a lesson that you won't forget in a hurry." Opening the trap, he seized the puppet by the collar and carried him to his house as if he had been a young lamb. When he reached the yard in front of the house, he threw him roughly on the ground, and putting his foot on his neck, he said to him, "It is late, and I want to go to bed. We will settle our accounts tomorrow. In the meanwhile, as the dog who kept guard at night died today, you shall take his place. You shall be my watchdog." And taking a great collar covered with brass knobs, he strapped it tightly round his throat, that he might not be able to draw his head out of it. A heavy chain attached to the collar was fastened to the wall. "If it should rain tonight," he then said to him, "you can go and lie down in the kennel. The straw that has served as a bed for my poor dog for the last 4 years is still there. If unfortunately robbers should come, remember to listen sharply and to bark." After giving him this last injunction, the man went into the house, shut the door, and put up the chain. Poor Pinocchio remained lying on the ground, more dead than alive, from the effects of cold, hunger, and fear. From time to time he put his hands angrily to the collar that tightened his throat, and said, crying, "It serves me right. Decidedly, it serves me right. I was determined to be a vagabond and a good-for-nothing. I would listen to bad companions, and that is why I always meet with misfortunes. If I had been a good little boy, as so many are, if I had been willing to learn and to work, if I had remained at home with my poor papa, I should not now be in the midst of the field and obliged to be the watchdog to a peasant's house. Oh, if I could be born again, but now it is too late, and I must have patience." Relieved by this little outburst, which came straight from his heart, he went into the dog kennel and fell asleep.